This will be a 2-week class. This week, part 1, will be the idea of government itself, with a focus more on how we got where we did in the United States, and what was the role that Christianity or Judeo-Christian, a Judeo-Christian understanding of the world played in the founding of the nation. I mean, a lot of people don't know this, but the founders often analogize themselves to Israel and Moses. In fact, some of them consider George Washington a kind of a Moses figure. And so we're going to look at that and look at the relationship between government and religion. It's not always an easy relationship. You know, just a few weeks ago, the Supreme Court rebuked the state of California for closing down churches more strictly than it closed comparable uses. And California tried to justify it on the basis that, hey, these other uses are commercial. They're more important because we really need the tax revenues. And the counter argument was, oh, are they really more important? Maybe that betrays something about your view and the way that you see the world. And then we're also going to focus today on the idea that as Christians in a civil society, we have rights. Why is that? Where do they come from? Because that's really at the core of a lot of what's happening. Week 2, next week, we're going to change the focus a bit. We're going to look more at the idea of politics in the nation. You know, we are unique in world history. The United States was an experiment that really had not been tried the way it was. I mean, there were sputtering attempts at limited forms of democracy among the Greeks and even the Romans to some extent. But we are unique. We're not a theocracy. The founders did not want a theocracy, which frankly would be a bad idea for a nation like this. This will be in week 2. At the same time, we have a right to participate in government. We're not ruled by kings, as most of the ancient world was at the time the Bible was written. So how do we take biblical principles written at a time when kings were ruling and things were very different and transport those principles into a democratic republic? So those are kind of the issues framed out broadly. And so we'll go into this week, again, more the concept of rights and government more broadly. All right. So what are rights and where do they come from? If somebody said to you, well, we're not going to allow you to get a driver's license. Well, why not? I don't like the way you look. Really? Yeah, I don't like the way you look. And I'm the government official, and I said so. You would say, I have a right to this. And you would be correct. And that would be an official who could be reversed in courts. When I was back in New York in private practice, I had a lot of cases for what they call equal access. And my favorite of them was a case against the town of Babylon, very fitting name. And they had a policy, I'm not making this up, that said we reserve the right to deny anybody the use of our space for any reason we like. Now, to a lawyer, this is like a sirloin steak to a man who hasn't eaten in a week, you know. And after the first witness, I just have fond memories of the case because the first witness was done. The judge said, can I see the counsel in my chambers? Yep. We went back. As he's taking off his robe, he looks at opposing counsel and he says, you lose. And then it went downhill for him from there. Okay, so we have these rights. And those rights include conscience, and they also include religious liberty. Now, conscience and religious liberty are not the same thing, but they're closely related. There were rights of conscience, for example, the conscientious objectors during the war, things like that. Or there were the Jehovah's Witnesses who didn't want to be compelled to have their kids say the Pledge of Allegiance in class. Combination of their religious views, but also conscience. Now, extracting from the Bible, many Bible commentators and scholars have said, with some variations, that there are different spheres. And there are ways to analyze and understand every sphere, and that they need to know their right place in a functioning democracy. And they usually start with the sphere of the individual. There's self-governance for an individual, then they go to the sphere of family and the rights in family, then they go to church, and then they go to government. We are only going to be looking at civil government today. We're not going to be examining any of these other spheres. And again, we're going to look with a particular focus on politics. So the American experience is something unique. I asked the question earlier, where do rights come from? There's really only two answers. If you live in a nation and you have a right to something, you either have it because, one, the people in charge, the governing officials, give you that right, or number two, the right comes from a source above government. It comes from God, and it's inherent in being a human being. There's really no other answer to this. They're either God-given or else they are the product of man. So I want to start by looking at a revolution that occurred not quite 250 years ago, major nation. One of the chief rallying cries was liberty. You probably think I'm talking about the American Revolution. No, I'm actually talking about the French Revolution. French Revolution was started in 1789, so you're talking roughly 13 years after the American Revolution. Its rallying cry was liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality, fraternity. And the French Revolution overthrew an abusive monarchy. It lasted about 10 years till 1799, until a general named Napoleon, yes, that Napoleon, came along. And the fruit of that revolution was to pave the way for something like a dictator to come and take over control of the nation. So its outcome was not very good. What did they believe in the French Revolution? Well, the French Revolution started with, and you have some notes on this, the National Constituent Assembly. They abolished all kinds of things. They wanted to abolish all of what they called the old orders. And part of what this ruling assembly did was, in the name, again, of liberty and equality, and those words, kind of rang out everywhere. They looked like they were giving people all kinds of rights. Probably about half the men, no rights were extended to women, isn't that interesting? About half the men were afforded some kind of right, but they were actually quite limited. And the little ruling body really, had control of everything. But they were very much atheistic. In fact, they confiscated the lands of the Roman Catholic Church. Initially, they did that to pay their debts. Well, somebody's got to pay. Well, why not the church? They've been, abusers and all that. And then they converted a lot of the churches into factories and into, places of commerce and all that. But they didn't stop there. They wanted to eradicate references to the Christian faith. And they did it gradually. It started with the confiscation of churches, but it didn't end there. The initial step was followed by the courts that were set up. And under these courts, there were trials. There was the arrest of about 300,000 persons, historians estimate, about 17,000 of which were executed on Madame Guillotine. And so the process in looking at faith was very interesting. The French leaders decided that they were going to worship, they called it, the goddess of reason. So as they closed down churches, they would bring a cart into a little French village. They'd put a woman on top of the cart, usually a young girl. They'd dress her up a little bit, and they'd require everybody to come out to the town square, and they'd say, "Behold, the goddess of reason. We now worship the goddess of reason." Did any of you have to, in high school, I think I had to read it, a novel called The Scarlet Pimpernel? Anybody have to read that beside me? Yeah, I didn't appreciate it at the time. Being in high school, I was just trying to get out of reading it. Were there cliff notes for it? There weren't. I may have to read some of it. But they have scenes like that in there. In fact, the lead character was trying to smuggle people out who were going to be executed by the French. That was the whole idea. So here's some of the things that happened. The next step after confiscating lands were the Catholic priests were imprisoned, and then they started executing Catholic priests if they sort of did not recant their faith. New priests that were appointed had to take an oath of loyalty to the government. And this is a historical tactic. It's happened many times. When the National Socialists, the Nazis, took over in Germany, Hitler allowed churches to function, but superficially. And what he required was, if you're going to be a church and a pastor, you have to sign an oath of loyalty that you will never teach anything that contradicts the tenets of National Socialism. So when National Socialism decided it's time to exterminate Jews, you couldn't speak against it. You had to agree with everything that they said, or you were no longer a church. So there was the antagonism between church and state that way. Interestingly, a slogan that they used, and this is not widely known, was separation of church and state. There's a right understanding of separation of church and state. They appropriated the slogan, but they did it, very abusively. Then some of the other things that happened was then all displays of public worship were forbidden. And then this is interesting, all visible signs of Christianity were removed. They actually went into graveyards where there were individual tombstones with a cross marking somebody's grave, and they would scratch out the cross. I mean, what's the thinking behind that sort of thing? Somebody's personal grave, right? You can understand it was probably spiritual forces behind all of that. And that's not unique, by the way. George Orwell, author of classics like Animal Farm, 1984, and so on, wrote in one of his books when he went to fight in the Spanish Civil War, he was puzzled by why the side that was hostile to faith, that was promoting the revolution, why they would snap off crosses in churches and scratch out crosses from tombstones. Well, they were probably inspired by the French Revolution. But they did more than that. They decided to repudiate all evidence of Christianity and Christian faith. They wanted to convert the calendar from a 7-day calendar to a 10-day calendar. Why? Well, 7 days was started by the Judeo-Christian tradition, so they could have a Sabbath. We don't need Sabbaths. Let's have a 10-day calendar. They renamed the year to the year 1, the year of the revolution. They wanted to change the names of any days of the week that they thought might have had some hidden Christian vestiges in it, not knowing probably that most of them came from actually Rome, and all these sorts of things. So it was essentially an atheistic revolution, or a revolution. There was no God. The worship was of man and of reason. And so because, and when I say man, of course, I know sometimes in circles, mankind means, men and women. When I'm in an academic setting, I have to be careful of that. And you have to choose your words, more carefully. You'll give me a little grace here that I'm remembering from the old days. Right? So the rights were as good as what that little governing board wanted to do or give. And so as new people came in, what happened? Well, the old ones weren't doing it right. Now it's time to do it this way. And so you could be like the infamous Robespierre, who in the beginning was, yelling out off with their heads on everybody, until a new group came in that didn't like the way he did it, and Robespierre himself died on the guillotine as well. See, when there's no set source of rights, obeying today what the government tells you can get you in trouble 5 or 10 years later when there's a new sheriff in town and you look back at what was accepted once upon a time and you judge it by a contemporary lens. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah. So one of the thinkers of the French Revolution, François de Charette, said this. I'll try to pronounce it in French. My apologies to actual French speakers out there. On ne saurait faire une omelette sans casser des œufs. You can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. The reference was, we're baking a beautiful revolution over here, and so are we going to have some casualties? Sure. But you can't help it. You want to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. Well, that saying started there, most historians think, but others were fond of quoting it. Joseph Stalin was fond of quoting it. The communists in Russia often quoted it. And see, the thing is, it's one thing to make it sort of a quaint saying, it's another thing to see it in practice. You know, when Joseph Stalin thought Ukraine was a little too rebellious, he systematically starved the people of Ukraine, the breadbasket of the old Soviet Union. The wheat was harvested and starving people watched it shipped out in boxcars. If you Google it to this day, you'll see pictures of these, people working in the fields, these starving, emaciated children watching the food go away. Historians think there were probably close to 4 million people starved under Stalin's whim. A few eggs getting broken. And this is the story of the 20th century. Anybody who doesn't learn the history of these things, if you don't understand the history, then you're certainly doomed to repeat it. So you saw those things repeated in Maoist China and Nazi Germany and fascist Italy to different extents. They were all atheistic in practice, and they needed to be atheistic in practice because the state was the highest authority. If there was an authority higher than the state that could command your allegiance, then they were not in charge. And so the idea of religious liberty or freedom was intolerable to them. Now contrast this to the American Revolution 13 years earlier and the source of ideas found there. The Declaration of Independence, you all know it, you could quote it, we hold these truths to be self-evident. And let me pause there. The words are high and lofty, you can lose the common meaning of them. Self-evident means we don't even have to defend this. This is obvious. When my kids were teenagers, they would go, Dad, duh. Okay, so this is kind of like a duh. All right. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is how they saw it. The Declaration speaks of the laws of God. It references God as a creator. It talks about nature as God. It talks about a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men were created equal. Now, in fact, were all men created equal at that time? No. There was an ideal expressed that sowed the seeds for future reform that we'll get to in a moment. But remember as well, the founders involved in this were products of the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening took place between, say, 1730 and 1770, roughly. So they were very much steeped in these kinds of views. And you had men like George Whitefield, you had John and Charles Wesley, you had Jonathan Edwards, and even people who are not particularly devout. Benjamin Franklin was not particularly devout, but if you read his autobiography, he formed a friendship with probably the leading evangelist of his day, George Whitefield. He would go to hear Whitefield preach, and he would jokingly say, one time he had me so convicted, I wasn't going to put any money in. I decided to put some money in. He kept preaching. I decided I'd have to be a little more. He said, then I was hoping he'd stop because I was going to have to empty my pockets. And this is Benjamin Franklin, not particularly devout, who ends up making a motion to start the Continental Congress sessions in prayer. I actually included some quotes from founders at the back of your notes. You don't have to turn there, you can see it later. But he said some remarkable things, like he said to his, when they were arguing largely over the issue of slavery, and it looked like the Union might not form, he said, when we were fighting the revolution, this is a paraphrase, he said, we were aware of divine guidance. We sought it earnestly. And have we now forgotten the Creator without whom we couldn't have won this? And he says something like, if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, how much more can a nation be built without his blessing? And he moved to start the sessions in prayer, a practice that continues to this day, incidentally. And so these were the influences. Now, when I sometimes, I end up doing I did over the years, do a lot of debates. And it's kind of unusual, but I like hostile settings. Don't ask me why. The more hostile it is, the better. I feel like I have nothing to lose and maybe, a few to gain. And a lot of times what you find is when you're going in there, and okay, this is going to represent the Christian side, they don't really understand the Christian faith or its presentations. As somebody said, it's not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting, it's that it hasn't been tried. And mostly I find that, when I'm in those debates, there's straw men, there are, just caricatures and all that. And they're surprised, to hear some things in these. But they'll typically say, oh, everybody knows most of the quotes for the Constitution they were people who were suspicious of religion, like Thomas Paine or Hume. That's who the founders were quoting. Well, somebody sat down and did a survey and read through and the quotes and all that in the Federalist Papers that were like the history of the of the first Constitutional Congress and how we formed it. And they read the quotes and what were they thinking and all that. And they took the top 5. Well, Paine didn't make it. Hume came in number 5 at 2.9%. After that, you have Locke at 2.9%, Sir William Blackstone 7.9%, the Baron Montesquieu 8.3%, and in first place at 9%, the Apostle Paul. And the top 3 dwarf all of the others. And the top 3 are really important. The Baron Montesquieu was a believing Christian who pushed very hard for a separation of powers because he said you can't have power in one place. Men are intrinsically evil. We're not good. We have sin nature, and you have to have checks and balances and a division of power. Well, you see how that was carried through into the Constitution. We got an interesting lesson in it, this week, didn't we? And Sir William Blackstone was the leading constitutional scholar and commentator on the law in his day. He was a devout Christian. He saw all law as coming from natural law and derived by God. So these were the influencers on the thoughts of the Americans. And now I've heard in debates, well, we have a godless constitution. I'll come back to that thought in a moment. And you'll see them say, well, the nation was really founded by the Constitution. It wasn't founded under the Declaration. It was the Constitution. And there's no mention of God in the Constitution. Well, first of all, the founders did not reckon the founding from the Constitution. 1863, Abraham Lincoln, the Gettysburg Address, 87 years ago, 87 years ago, our fathers brought forth a new nation, conceivable, right? Take 1863, subtract 87. It's very complicated math. You may want to try it later at home with a calculator. It comes out to 1776. They considered the founding of the nation the Declaration of Independence. So the Constitution, too, is full of ideas that come from the Bible. Some of you were in my the Tuesday night chronological Bible study that we do, and as we were going through Exodus recently, we're talking about how it's the foundation of our laws today, how the thoughts expressed in the Scripture are just inseparable from the common assumptions we make in law today. So you even find things like, and I just quoted one, I could have quoted a dozen, Article 3, Section 3, no person be convicted of treason under the testimony of 2 witnesses. This idea comes directly out of the book of Deuteronomy. In fact, some people go even further. I don't know if this is the case or not. Some people try to make a case for it. I've never seen it definitely proved. But they quote Isaiah 33, verse 22, where God, speaking through Isaiah, says that God is our judge, he's our lawgiver, he's our king. Now, so there you see the three parts in the character of God: our lawgiver, legislature; our judge, judicial; our king, executive. So was even the inspiration for three branches, did that come out of Isaiah 33:22? Maybe it did, but there are many that are really clear. And look at some of the quotes that I attached later, and you'll see the faith of the founders. It's really unquestionable how heavily influenced they are. I put in a quote by Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story in his famous commentary from the Constitution in 1833, so much closer to the events. And Story, incidentally, was really not a believing Christian. He was more of a kind of a deist or something like that, but he understood the concept of the founding of the nation and why it is that our rights are derived from God. And so you can see some of his quote there, and I won't read it all, but I'll read some. Probably at the time of the adoption of the Constitution and of the amendments to it, the sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state, so far it is not incompatible with private rights of conscience and the freedom of religious worship. Indeed, in a republic, there would seem to be a peculiar propriety in viewing the Christian religion as the great basis on which it must rest for its support and permanence, if it be what it has ever been deemed by its truest friends to be, the religion of liberty. So what happened? How did we reach the state that we got to? In 1996, there were two scholars named Kramick and Moore who published a book called The Godless Constitution and the Case Against Religious Correctness. Now, they were not citing all of history. They were arguing their viewpoint. And their book just became attractive to people on the left who wanted to minimize Christian influence. And so it got pushed out into law schools, repeated, finally to the point it just got accepted as dogma. Well, this is it. It was obviously a godless constitution. God's and Christian values had nothing to do with it. And so, there have been times in debates, I've had people, they'll quote from the book, and they'll say, oh, you don't understand, the Constitution was framed to be free of God. God's not mentioned. Well, you can get them easily on a technicality. You can say, well, yeah, God is positively mentioned. Where? In the attestation clause, the end of the Constitution. Subscribed to in the year of our Lord. And sometimes they said in the year of our Lord Jesus Christ, and then they, give the year. And so it's not reality, it's a viewpoint. They ignore all of the evidence, and what they do is they cite a few people who were anti-federalists that day, and they take their quotes often out of context to try to prove that faith had nothing to do with the founding of the nation. So what's the takeaway for today? We're seeing the playing out of this clash of worldviews. Those who hold a Christian worldview, or even a worldview, a Judeo-Christian worldview. I have very close friends who are Orthodox Jews who totally kind of with where I was on some of the issues, and I've gone out to dinner with them and gotten to know them better, and there's some really remarkable and wonderful people. But there's a secular view, and I think it's just worth saying, making a footnote here about Marxism, because it's interesting how many of these views developing today are grounded in Marxism. Sometimes they'll even quote, that they have a Marxist view of the world. And Marxism is atheistic by intention, by design, because Marxism, which slid seamlessly into, the beliefs in the Russian Revolution, sees the world as a class struggle that comes from economic inequalities. And everything is boiled down to this economic problem. And so when you centralize everything and you take away that evil profit motive, central planning is going to work and solve all the problems, and we'll all share equally. The only problem is, it's been tried many times, It doesn't work. It just simply doesn't work. You disincentivize people from getting ahead, then there's no reason, to do anything more. But nonetheless, it initially embraces a kind of relativism when it's on the outside. When it's on the outside, it talks about tolerance. And then once it's on the inside and it consolidates power, historically, the way it's operated, it has very little concern for tolerance. Stalinist trials, if you offended Stalin by something, heaven help you if you were the first one to stop clapping at one of his speeches. That was the old joke. Don't be the first one to stop clapping at the end of his speech. You could end up on the list. The trial lasted about 3 minutes. You were taken out and you were shot. So, this was the way these things worked. Disfavored people then were kind of removed. Disfavored people from the past disappeared. Trotsky was on the wrong side of Lenin and then Stalin, and when he saw it wasn't working out for him, he left the country, he fled. He was assassinated in Mexico. And then if you look at pictures of the Russians, you'll see the initial picture, you'll see all the heads there, and you'll see Trotsky. They just airbrushed him out. You see the pictures now. He's removed from all the pictures as if he didn't exist. And the rules keep changing. Instead of equality, the people at the top become the favored and control everything. George Orwell captured it brilliantly in a great novel, Animal Farm. There were the 7 commandments painted on the wall of the barn, and one at a time they're being crossed out until the last one, which said, all animals are created equal. And the little pig is caught in the act of changing it again to say, but some animals are more equal than others. That's really the idea behind it. So where are we now as a nation? I think we've been well into the relativism phase for a long time, and now we're passing into what follows it, which is compelled beliefs. It's a prelude. The prelude to compelled beliefs is rewriting the past. You have to destroy the symbols of old. You destroy the ideas and the belief of people of old. So it's even shocking to see, how can we be removing statues of Lincoln and Washington? Well, they weren't perfect by today's standards. They were towering giants by the standards of their day. We owe these founders and others, great debts. But it's not seen that way. And you kind of slide into relativism, where we continue, people continue to identify themselves by their feeling. There's a loss of connection to objective truth. It's what I feel, and nobody has the right to impose their beliefs on me. A couple of times I've been in debates, and someone will stand up in the audience in the Q&A. It's often a young person, and they'll say something like this. Yeah, I have a question for you. Certainly. Who are you to impose your Christian beliefs on me? I don't accept your Christian beliefs. They're not truth for me, because there is no absolute truth. Each person makes his own truth. And usually this kind of statement is met by applause, like the words just rolled off Mount Sinai or something like that. So, what do you do with this? It's tempting on the one hand to just say something like, to ask them, so we cannot be certain about anything. We can't be positive about anything. That's right. And you're positive, you're certain we can't be positive about anything. I'd like to ask that, to see if they get the irony of it, but that would be scoring cheap points. So instead, with somebody like that, I would often say, well, help me understand your view here. Everybody's truth is to them, whatever they want, right? Yes. So I guess then that you have no problem with Nazi Germany exterminating people they thought were inferior. That was their truth. Well, now it's uncomfortable, because in society today, the one acceptable villain is still Nazis. They're the villains in 2 of the 3 original Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. You can always make Nazis the bad guy. You can't go wrong with that. So discomfort. So you would say that the Nazis were fine doing what they did. Well, no. Well, and then you press in a little more. And I assume when slaveholders got angry at abolitionists who were Christian, and they said, "You're imposing your faith on us. How dare you impose your faith on us? If you don't want to own slaves, don't own them. It's our right to own slaves." I suppose you're upset with those faith-based persons who pressed based on their Christian morality. They should have just shut up and let their other persons. Well, now it's even worse for them. Now, I've seen some that begin actually perspiring. And they say, well, no. Well, why not? And now they have to come up with an answer. Well, because they hurt people. Well, so what? That's Darwinism. The strong always dominate the weak. If there's no basis for morality, then why can't the strong dominate the weak? What's the problem with it? There seems to be nothing wrong with that. And then at some point you try to get back because you want it to be redemptive, and you say, look, I have a view of these things. I accept the teachings of Jesus Christ, the understanding that he wants us to have humility and grace and forgiveness, all these other things. And I can say, I think that was an evil practice because we're all created by God in his image. We all have equal value in the act of creation. So you can kind of then start to work those things in. But relativism ultimately it kind of collapses on itself because it's not based on anything provable or objective. And once you remove objective, if I can decide that I'm anything I want, that's happening now with sex. If it can happen with sex, why can't it happen with race? Why can't it happen with, frankly, anything objective? There was that woman, what was her name, Rachel something Dolbeer, I'm forgetting her name now, who was very much white, but identified as black and got a perm and tinted her skin. And when she was exposed, she said, well, you don't get this. This is deeper. And I listened very carefully what she said. There was something like, inward, my real personality is I'm really African. Say, well, why not? If there's no objective truth, if everything is disconnected, that's what happens. So religious faith then becomes a threat to that type of thinking because there's a conscience, and the leaders who think that way cannot have anything higher. You cannot have rights higher than the king. You see it many times in the scripture when the 3 Hebrew children were in the plain of Shinar in Babylon, and they refused to bow down to the gold image that Nebuchadnezzar constructed. Nebuchadnezzar being a good, reliable tyrant at that point of his life before his kind of conversion, had them over and said, maybe you fellows didn't get the memo. Maybe your hard drive crashed or something. Musicians, they're going to play. You bow down and worship. And the 3 children answered, King, we don't even have to think about this one. This is an easy one for us. This is self-evident, they might have said if they lived a little later. God is able to protect us, and even if he doesn't, we're not going to worship your image. And being a king with ultimate authority, they ended up, being thrown into the furnace, and then, of course, they miraculously come out of the furnace. You all know the story. I think right now we have passed from the stage of relativism well into the attack to silence people now and shut down the debate. A lot of you, are aware, kind of cancel culture or this or that. But when it happens with government, it's more frightening. When I was working in my career at a nonprofit doing legal work on these cases until this past December 31st, we had so many of these cases. So let me give you a few just to give you an idea. So we represent a number of Catholic adoption agencies. They do foster care and adoption. Increasingly, states got along with them. They were some of the biggest and best adoption agencies in the state. They had networks into Catholic families, through their church network and all that. Well, the state comes along like New York did and said, well, from now on, you have to start placing children with same-sex couples. The Catholic adoption agency said, look, we have a religiously informed view of marriage. So when those requests come, and they're very, very rare, we have 4 or 5 cooperating agencies. We respectfully refer the people to those. They're able to get the service. No one's ever been turned away. And we focus on our area, which is faith informed. Well, that's not good enough for New York anymore. That arrangement existed for decades. And suddenly the state said, no good any longer. You yourself must violate your conscience and make those referrals. And if you don't, you're no longer licensed. Well, you go to the state in argument, you say, well, look, no children are being unserved. If anything, if you shut them down, you're losing a really effective adoption agency. You'll have more kids in foster care, and you're already at crisis levels. You've told us that. And we asked the state, is there a single person anywhere who wanted to adopt and was unable to do so because of this agency? No, not even one. Guess what? It made no difference because you were believing the wrong thing. You are not aligned to the new state orthodoxy. And we saw these cases over and over. In California, and by the way, one thanks be to God, we won that case in the Federal Appeals Court in New York. Or in California, California passed a law a few years back, and it said if you are a Christian pregnancy resource center, you now have to advertise abortion. You have to give people who come into your center a phone number and say, and by the way, if you want an abortion and you can't afford it, the state will provide one for you. Here you go. And when people said, when they said, no, hold on, I don't want to advertise, that's against the message that I'm trying to communicate. Do you ask Planned Parenthood to talk about adoption? Of course not. Don't be ridiculous. Why would we do that? Well, exactly. That's the point. And the Supreme Court struck down that California law. I could give you a lot of other examples. Instead, for the sake of time, and I can hit more of these next week, I'll just say, be careful when you hear words, tolerance, discrimination. Words condition us on how to think. They shape ideas. How many people think tolerance is a moral good? Show of hands. Don't be shy. Anybody? Okay. It's not. Tolerance is just a way to get along. I see a Dodgers. Tolerance used to be if you live and you root for the Dodgers and your next door neighbor roots for the San Francisco Giants, you'll still get along. You'll check his mail for him and he'll loan you his lawnmower. Now tolerance is twisted to mean you must accept everything I say and even celebrate it. And if you don't, you're intolerant. It's classical intolerance posing as tolerance, appropriating the goodwill of the word while doing precisely the opposite thing in practice. Or discrimination. How many people think discrimination is a moral evil? Anybody? A lot of hands. Okay, stay with me. It's not a moral evil. To discriminate means you have criteria. The New York Yankees discriminate on the basis of athletic ability, or I would have been playing for them. A women's basketball team discriminates on the basis of sex. Churches have always discriminated on the basis of their beliefs. You don't tell a yeshiva you have to hire Muslims to teach the Torah. We've always understood these things. Discrimination becomes a moral evil when the underlying idea is a moral evil. And so the classic for our time is the moral stain of racism, of slavery, sliding into Jim Crow laws. That was immoral because the idea behind it that God did not create equally, that I'm entitled to subjugate somebody else because of their race, which they had no control over, is profoundly evil. So what the others have tried to do with these things is take the concept of discrimination and make everything the same. So if you have a moral belief about sexuality or about life or about these issues, they'll say, who are you to discriminate against me because of your religion? Your religion cannot be an excuse to discriminate. You see, that's the way it works. And everything gets reframed that way as if the any act of discrimination, any criteria. By the way, it used to be once upon a time, if you said to somebody, oh, you have discriminating taste, it was actually a compliment. And I'll point out when you go out to lunch today and you go to the salad bar, you will discriminate. All right. So you'll see tactics like this. You'll see tactics like, oh, Christianity is responsible for all the ills of the world. Christianity created and endorsed slavery and racism and this. They're so wrong, it's ridiculous. You need another class to deconstruct those. But this is the thing I want to point out about our system, and that is our system being based in faith and honoring God had the seeds to reform itself. See, you don't get that in the totalitarian or the statist view of the world. The people in charge are the highest authority. But we have built in a conscience, and God can convict us of things that were wrong. So the founders who made their mistakes, who were saying all men are created equal, even while they owned slaves, knew even then that some kind of showdown was inevitable. And the strongest abolitionists were always Christians, and it was based on their devout faith. You know, you see some beautiful stories in here. How many of you know the story of John Newton? Probably many of you, right? Amazing Grace. He was a slave trader, literally a slave trader. And God convicted him. He saw the evils of what he did when he became a believer, and he pastored a church. And William Wilberforce attended his church. William Wilberforce became a devout follower of Christ and said, based on Scripture, this is an evil. And he fought his entire life to eliminate slavery in the British Empire. He didn't see it until almost the very last days of his life as he passed away. Wilberforce's writings were so persuasive, his arguments were so cogent and incisive, that it really impressed a younger man named John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, who became president for one term, was defeated in his re-election term, but went back to the House of Representatives to argue against slavery, which he considered a profound evil. In 1848, John Quincy Adams died while Congress was in session. He was in the House. He was stricken. They brought him to a couch. He passed away. You can see that couch to this day, by the way, in the Supreme Court building. How it ended up there, I'm not sure. But John Quincy Adams was passionate about this thing. Sitting perhaps 10 to 15 feet away from John Quincy Adams was a young legislator just elected to Congress, fascinated by Adams, listening to him, who began his term in 1848. And that legislator for Illinois was named Abraham Lincoln. So taken was he with this. Although Lincoln, it's interesting to think about Lincoln's faith. I don't have time to hit it adequately. He profoundly had a view of God influencing all things and saw the evil happening here. So let's summarize this. Do we have rights as Christians? Yes, we do. The system gives us rights. Is it wrong to exercise your right as a Christian in the system? I don't think so. The Apostle Paul exercised his right of an appeal when he was getting railroaded in Festus's trial. You've appealed to Caesar you will go. But on the other hand, Paul considered all of his rights surrendered to Jesus Christ. He would never exercise his rights in a way that conflicted with the lordship of Jesus Christ. He chose the word Greek doulos for himself. A servant's not strong enough. Bondservant, something like a slave who in an act of love stays with the master and lets the master totally directs your life. And even Jesus surrendered his rights, while on this earth. We read in Matthew 26 when Jesus says, "Don't you think I could call on my Father and he would immediately send 12 legions of angels?" But he wasn't going to do that. He surrendered his rights for our salvation. And a legion of angels, a legion would be somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000, considering one angel killed 185,000 Assyrians in one night. 12 legions of angels could probably do some serious damage. So, and again, in his trial before Pilate, when Pilate said, "I have the power to put you to death. Why are you quiet?" Jesus said, "You could have no power over me at all, except it was given to you from on high." So there are times that we are called to surrender our rights. Do we lose if there's persecution? No. Are we boarded up? Are we out of business? This is the great thing. Despair is ultimately a sin because it doesn't trust God. Our task is to be faithful to God in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. Whatever happens in the government, whatever the cost is, cost was very high for Christians the first 3 centuries in Rome. You know what happened in France after the fall of the revolutionary movement? Toward the end of it, there was a renewed interest in the Catholic Church. People began going into the priesthood. The Catholic Church had a resurgence because out of persecution was born a new desire to find God, and that was really the predominant church. You didn't really find many Protestants there. I'll close with this story, and then I want to give you a few minutes for questions. I was with a friend of mine who was the president. I was on his board of a ministry to China, and he did a lot with house church leaders, and we got to study the great revival in China, where today there may be 150 million Christians. It's probably the largest church of any true believing church of any nation in the world. And it was born out of intense persecution. The Maoist purges, the purges that followed it, and the more crackdown there was, nobody prays for persecution. You know, Paul said, pray that you have godly leaders. We don't want persecution, but if it comes, we have to stand in it. And he was a very, very intelligent guy. He was working with the University of Beijing. He was like the Harvard of China. Never at a loss for words. Quick, fast. He seemed to know everything. And I asked him one time, is there some connection you could see between the growth of the church in China, how it happened? Did it happen more on the coast? Was it near rivers? Was there some kind of thing that you could point to? It's the first time I ever saw him quiet. He stopped talking. He bowed his head. He was collecting his thoughts. And then when he started speaking, his voice was breaking a little bit. And he said, Joe, if you took a map of China and you marked the spots where the persecution was severe, and you put a transparency of the revivals on top of it, they correspond exactly to where the blood of the saints was shed. So we don't lose in anything. We don't despair in anything. But we want to be aware of these things so we can exercise our rights as informed citizens, that we don't have to go through these things. And we'll drill down more on that next week when we go into politics. We have a few minutes, so questions. Yes? Yes, right.
So if the Declaration of Independence had so much basis and Christian values, how come that didn't really translate over to the rights of man, where majority were?
So the question is about Thomas Jefferson, who was very concerned with the rights of man. How come that didn't translate over more? I would say it actually did translate over. More than we realize. So Jefferson, of course, was more of a deist. But Jefferson, I think I included one quote from him, was persuaded of the moral truth as the right basis for ensuring those rights. Jefferson was kind of among the more extreme. He actually was fascinated with the French Revolution. He was there, he was studying it, and he was kind of, you say things like, it's good to shed some blood. What was the exact quote? I forget, but the idea was, shedding some blood now and then is not a bad thing. Sounds like it's more of like a mafia quote or something. But Jefferson realized the French experiment had gone wrong because it didn't ensure the rights of man. So, but Jefferson had issues with certain things that were happening. It was not a unanimous doctrine. I would say it's more like it was the background of the first Great Awakening just started conditioning the thoughts of people, even the ones who didn't necessarily agree with the religious revivals. It got the culture thinking a certain way. And Jefferson was sympathetic to that. So I would put it that way. Yeah. Questions? Yes?
Where does Sharia
Yeah, so the question was, where does Sharia law and where does, sort of the Jewish Orthodox law fit into this? This is an interesting question. And the Jewish law fits more naturally with Christian values because obviously Christianity has no meaning without the Old Testament. It's the fulfillment, it's the foundation of our belief. Scholars have really wrestled with Sharia because taken to its logical extent in some cases, it actually undermines and undoes the idea of rights. So if you look at places where Sharia law is controlling, you don't see Christian churches, you don't see Jewish synagogues. In some of those places, you could be punished, even killed, for just professing faith. So at some point, it clashes with it. And the way that we've resolved it is when courts test how far your religious beliefs can go. Courts say, okay, if you have a sincerely held religious belief, you get a lot of deference, but it's not unlimited. The burden on the state is very high. You have to, government, show a compelling government interest and that you're pursuing it narrowly. That's why Hobby Lobby was one of our cases. We won that Hobby Lobby didn't have to provide abortifacients in their health coverage, certain abortifacients that violated their conscience. The state had overreached on that because it wasn't narrowly done. The problem with Sharia law is it will, if you can have an honor killing, we just have a consensus in the nation that we can say, does the government have a compelling interest in not allowing killing? Yes, that's a compelling interest. There's no more narrow way to do it than to say you can't kill a member of your family over an issue of honor. And so Islam, interestingly, kind of conflicts. It comes under the protections of American free exercise of religion. There's a tension there because the American system was set up more naturally for the assumptions behind the Judeo-Christian way of thinking and processing. And so when Islam comes up, you're going to find those tensions. The thing is, the most common expressions of Islam in this country are actually very toned down statistically. I mean, I've read studies on it because they tend to Americanize and start adopting American values. Not everybody, obviously, I'm generalizing, but it's very different than what you find in pockets in France or England where there's more resistance to assimilation. So it does create some unique issues and challenges. Time for one more question. Yes?
How prepared is the church overall in the Western world or in the United States to face these challenges?
Yeah, great question to end on. How prepared is the church in America to respond to these challenges? It's a mixed bag. There is a core of people who are willing to stand for biblical values, a core of churches, but it's not unusual that you'll hear, this old-time denomination now is ordaining gay clergy and they can enter a same-sex relationship. You'll hear those things, but there's a core that's standing firm. I think you have a large enough remnant committed to the truth of God's word, but there's constant pressure from the culture. And I think when the church shrinks to a size that it can stand against the culture, I think this is inevitable. If we have hostile government that doesn't want to see free exercise of religion, the inevitable thing is, well, okay, it's a new day now. Church, we give you tax-exempt status. Well, we don't know if we should do that if you discriminate. Discrimination is anti-discrimination is our highest. So if you don't agree to everything we say, kind of like what happened in Germany, what's happened in other places, if you don't agree with everything we say, we're taking away your tax-exempt status. I'll tell you, I would not want to stand before God someday and say, well, yeah, I caved in on everything, but I kept the tax-exempt status, Lord, something like that. But that's, my answer to that is always like when I do pastors' conferences, my answer is, hey, if God calls us to go through a time of tax-exempt status loss, lose it. Stand for truth. I don't think that Paul and Peter and James, I don't think they had tax-exempt status in Rome, if I'm kind of recalling correctly. So I think that there is a remnant, but it's a kind of critical time because we're passing from the tolerance thing to the pressure thing to now the forced compulsion. I think we're seeing the forced compulsion come. I could give you a dozen cases we've worked on. There's just not time. I'll try to tell you a few more next week. And the more intense the pressure gets, the more you'll find some people on the edges giving into it. But I think as long as we can analyze these things and talk about them and encourage the church to stand, we're in the game. We'll be faithful to God. We win. Your question, incidentally, is why I left the practice of law. I felt it was more important to do this and focus on this and be a resource for churches full time instead of the old stuff with the cases. So thank you. You've been a great audience. If you came this week, try to come to the same hour next week so we kind of spread out because we had a lot of signups for this. So we'll close in prayer. Father, thank you again for your truth, for the amazing kindness and love that you have for us. Thank you for the great privilege to stand for you in times when things are difficult. Just strengthen our hearts, our understanding. Let us in love serve you with just new commitment to honor you in Jesus' name. Amen. And just one thing, by the way, I added something from Dr. Martin Luther King, letter from the Birmingham jail, which I read regularly to remind myself is one of the most inspired pieces you'll ever read on how Christianity led him to break laws when a law was immoral, what that tension was, and how that led to it was the foundation of the civil rights movement. It was a moral foundation in Christianity. So thank you. Blessings to you all.